Good afternoon. Excited to be here. Yesterday I talked a little bit about ActiFi. Today I'm really going to focus on adoption strategies. We heard Gabe yesterday talk about gamification. I'm going to really take some of the concepts that he shared and break them down a little bit more specifically as to how they can be applied in this industry. So kind of what I'm going to get at is really four things. So I'm going to cover each of these and you'll see how they all build on each other. One, we're going to talk about incentives. The reason they're at the top is they're sort of the icing on the cake. Two, I'm going to get into field engagement. How do you engage reps to really want to drive adoption on your behalf? Number three, using marketing triggers. And then lastly, talk a little bit about reporting and leaderboards, some of the concepts that we've seen. And we've worked with north of 300 clients and been able to really differentiate those who have been able to drive effective adoption and usage from those who haven't. And a lot of it are these elements. So I've kind of broken these things down into these four buckets, and I'm going to share some of the concepts. So let's just dive in. Let's talk a little bit about incentives. And Gabe yesterday had a really helpful slide, had incentives as sort of the fourth rung on the hierarchy. And I think that's an accurate way to describe them, but they can be extremely effective. So what are some of the ways that make them effective? One is driving awareness. How do you make people aware? Things that there is something available. There's something to achieve that comes with a reward. Number two is the whole personal social aspect. And then lastly, that these are, again, part of a broader stack. So let me give you a couple of very specific examples as we think about using incentives. How do we actually apply these to real world problems? So I'm going to use a financial planning example. So what I want to do is I've just bought an enterprise license of some financial planning software for my advisors. And what I don't want is them trained on how to use it, because I really don't care. And that's one of the things that I think is important to understand. Training does not equal usage. What I want is people to use it. So I'm not going to incent somebody to be well trained. What I'm going to incent them to do is to actually use it. And so what we did is we came up with this designation. In fact, the key was we didn't incent the advisor, we incented the paraplanner or the associate. So we created this designation, little emblem that said they were, and the firm kind of branded this, financial planning certified, and they got literally a new business card. Once they completed 15 plans for clients, the paraplanner, the associate, got a new business card, and they got a certificate differentiating them from the associate down the hall or the associate in another office. Now, from an economic standpoint, in this case, they didn't necessarily, they didn't give the folks a raise. You could give them a raise. In this case, it was $20 for new business cards with this really cool logo on it that said they were, planning certified, and a certificate. That one action had more impact on plans produced than anything else they did. And again, the cost, the hard dollar cost was the $20 for the new business card and maybe another $10 to ship a little, plaque that the associate could put in the cube, the paraplanner, that said that they were certified by having completed 15 plans that were actually delivered to end clients. So that's really kind of key, is that we're targeting the activity we're looking for and using the incentives in that way. So again, I don't care if they spent 500 hours training on the software, and if they spent 500 hours and they delivered 0 plans, none of the clients benefited. The additional revenue opportunities, the additional wallet share opportunities that actually come from planning aren't realized. I actually care about them delivering the plans. So that's a very concrete example of how can you use an incentive effectively. Let's talk about some other ways to use incentives. Visual reminders, same thing if you're trying to drive account opening, or you're trying to drive some other type of activity, giving little badges, giving little designations, they can either be digital, they can be physical, are important. And these things really do work. It gives people something to strive for. And I find, interestingly, that these tend to work better with associates than they do advisors. Because in many times, if you're the paraplanner or you're the associate working with the advisor, you don't have a real rich career track. So what do you have to aim for? What is something that you can embrace that you can achieve? Hey, I got to get to 15 plans and I get, this designation, I get this award. That works really well. Same thing can be applied on a new account opening specialist. These are really easy, effective, inexpensive things that you can do that will have a direct impact on the use of your solutions. Gamification. I'm not going to do, Gabe did a great job yesterday getting into the overall picture of gamification. One thing to think a little bit about, and I've read a lot on this concept, but it really is very intuitive as I think about it. There is more, when you think of discretionary time, this is time people have, they get to choose whatever they want to do with it. People spend more time playing games than just about any other activity. Not only do they spend time, they pay money. I'm a tennis player. If I look at what I spend on court time, what I spend on rackets and tennis balls and all this sort of stuff, it's significant, and I'm making the choice to do that. Why? Because of that, I love the sport, because of the competition, because of all these sorts of things. Why can't we take that innate human desire to have fun, to play games, to compete, and apply it to adoption and usage of our solutions? We certainly can. So when we did a lot of analysis and surveys and so forth, and asked people about gamification, here's some of the kind of words that you see coming up. Now there's a lot of software vendors out there that specialize in this kind of technology, like Bunchball and so forth, where you can overlay that on your CRM system, you can overlay that on a back office system where you can begin to put badges and points and recognition and that sort of thing for the activities you're looking for. And what I find with gamification is the simpler and more transparent that you can make it, the more effective it tends to be. You don't need to get into a whole lot of an elaborate scoring system. It's, hey, you get 1 point every time that you open an account, straight through on a fully digital basis. And when you get to 10 points, you get a badge associated with that. Simple things like that work. And as you advance, you can get a little bit more elaborate. But those are some of the things that we see from a gamification point of view. And again, I think this really gets down to the basics of human nature. I tend to find that people overemphasize training and underemphasize usage. If there's one message I would communicate today, and if you take nothing else away from this presentation, take this away. Training does not equal usage. Readiness equals usage. And usage is dependent on the three-legged stool of readiness. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later in my presentation, but readiness is the combination of motivation, skill, and time. So we're going to talk about, well, how do I assess that a bit later? In terms of, when you're starting to roll these kinds of initiatives out, you've got some concepts. What are some best practices? I'm going to give you 4 quick ones. One, put this in the spirit that it was intended. We're here to have fun. We want to do the right thing for our clients. We want to do business more efficiently, but work should be fun. It shouldn't always be work, so communicate that. Number 2, let's not, there shouldn't be a facade. Let's be real about this. We're doing this not because we want to just play fun games. We're doing this because it is a lot more efficient and a lot more cost effective to open new business straight through online than it is to process a bunch of faxes. That's our incentive. That's why we're doing this. We're not doing this just to make your job more fun. That's part of the equation. But again, advisors, staff, they're a skeptical bunch. They're going to see through, sort of falsities or things that aren't authentic. So you've got to be authentic as you do this. Third, the participation and collaboration, really recognizing that, encouraging that, organizing that at a regional level, getting champions to get their own circles. In most firms, there's groups of advisors that are friends that communicate. If you've built a good culture, these folks are used to getting together. There's a bit of a tipping point that we find. If you can get a couple of the folks sort of bought in, the skeptics kind of come along with it. So you've got to spend a bit of time up front, in terms of encouraging that participation, and then get creative in terms of how you communicate the messaging in creative ways, using multiple channels, whether it's online or doing a little page in the newsletter, or even, a physical object. We've seen folks, with the incentives, like it might be a cube or something that can sit on someone's desk. We find that those physical objects that are linked to these things tend to build awareness. So that's a bit on incentives and kind of gamification. The next thing, and this is really foundational. We've spent a lot of time on this, and I think that the software vendors are pretty dang good at this. I find broker-dealers are less good than they could be. So what are we talking about when we're talking about communication? Anytime we roll out a program, and that program may or may not involve software, we need to assume that it's going to take multiple iterations to get it right. How many of you are familiar with Eric Ries's Lean Startup methodology? Have you guys heard of Lean Startup? Couple. If you haven't, that's really a worthwhile book to publish. To read. Steve Blank was the gentleman who kind of founded these concepts, and they've really been tried and true. They're used extensively in Silicon Valley, and the genesis, or if you really boil it down, it's the concept of build, measure, learn. Well, part of measurement is getting feedback, and just like anybody in the software business would tell you, if your software isn't getting better, it's getting worse. There's no such thing as staying the same. If you're not constantly investing in a software platform, you're falling behind. Same thing as a broker-dealer. If you're not investing time and attention in making your core capabilities better, again, whether that's your planning program, whether it's a growth program, whether it's online account opening, if you're not iterating, you're getting worse, not better. And unfortunately, what we see all too often is these are put as projects. We have the project. The project launches in January. It launched. Now we're done. Project team disassembles, and they go on to the next project, instead of an ongoing, continuous improvement cycle. And that's, in a resource-constrained environment, that's difficult. But one of the ways you can make that, more visible is create these feedback loops. And it's a little bit, the first time around, I find firms are a little bit apprehensive about this. We're going to actually let our advisors provide us feedback in a visible format. Yep, we are. And we're going to process that feedback. So again, coming to advisors and saying up front, hey, this is version 1. We know it isn't perfect, and we're willing to listen. Not only are we willing to listen, but we're going to act. And then you get a little bit of skepticism. Oh yeah, I've been here before. You've said that before. So you've got to be able to use this, and you've got to be committed to executing as proof point that, no, this time is different. We will show you that we're listening. We will show you that we're acting, and it won't just be us. We'll have our advisors tell each other this, and that's the secret to this whole equation. So as you think about how do you do that, one of the things that and I'll tell you a story. We had this advisor, Mr. Skeptic, was rolling out a CRM system, really didn't like the system, and had all sorts of negative feedback, and they had posted this. So we ended up sitting down with them, separating the valid from invalid feedback, because the reality is you shouldn't do everything the advisors tell you to do. You've got to separate the wheat from the chaff. And in this case, there were a couple of really cool ideas that this advisor had, among a bunch of really stupid ones. But the cool ones were related to the way some of the data was organized. And we knew this advisor was influential, and he was one of the biggest skeptics coming in. So the team worked with him, and it was pretty simple. It was, in terms of reorganizing certain data elements in the CRM in a more logical group, and it was more logical the way he had articulated it, making that change, having him part of the process. So even though we ignored, 6 of the things that, we really didn't think were good ideas, ignored all that feedback, we did implement this one thing and really gave him full credit. So now this became his CRM. Mr. Skeptic, who couldn't say one nice thing about the CRM system, became Mr. Advocate. And we said, hey, Mr. Advocate, would you mind talking about what the feedback that you provided us and how this made the CRM better? And I think that's the key. And you don't need hundreds of these kinds of examples. You need a handful, especially the folks that influence, where it becomes their system. There's an interesting psychology. I won't get into all the psychological research behind this, but once someone feels a sense of ownership where you've taken their idea and implemented it and credited it to them, now it's their CRM. It's not your CRM. It's not the firm's CRM. This is mine. I contributed to this. And you can really take all these other criticisms, sort of go out the window. It's their CRM. Yes, it isn't perfect, and no CRM's perfect, but it's mine and it works. So that was an example of the Feature Minute Conference. And then the other thing is naming enhancements after advisors, even internally. This is the Jones enhancement. That's a very powerful technique, both culturally within the broker-dealer, to say, hey, we are here to help our advisors build better businesses. We're here to serve them. If we don't do a good job in serving them, we don't have jobs. So let's not forget that along the way, and let's do things that acknowledge that we are listening, we care, and we're naming specific feature enhancements that come through that. And then it becomes a collaborative effort. It's not an us versus them. Again, I think that the software vendors generally have done a very good job of this over the years, incorporating user feedback. I think that the broker-dealers could take a little page out of the vendor's playbook on some of this stuff. The other thing that's amazing, and I'm going to talk more about the readiness, is that firms assume, because the business case for this is obvious to them, that it is automatically obvious to the advisor. And I can assure you that is not the case. You need to have tools in your toolbox, and they can be just simple Excel spreadsheets. You don't have to program 2,000 lines of code to build a basic business case assessment. What is the cost savings? What are the reduction of NIGOs? What are some of the things that come with doing electronic order submission, electronic form filling? What are the advantages? Let's start doing the math. And here's the secret to doing this well. To make these things real, the advisors have to put their numbers in. You can't just say, well, here's the business case corporate came up with. They don't believe any of your numbers. They think your numbers are BS. They want their numbers in there and have that conversation. So that's really powerful. The other thing that I would say is, and I'm quoted on this frequently, for an advisor and really anyone to fully process a new concept, they've got to hear the same message 7 different times, 7 different ways. It's the old surround sound effect. I mean, if you think about watching a movie where you just have the TV versus if you have the whole full surround sound, it's 2 different experiences. So surround sound relative to driving usage of broker-dealer programs comes in 4 dimensions. One is the 0 to many. So this is the websites, emails, things that are mass communication any advisor anytime can get access to. Then you've got the one-to-many. These are national conferences, they're webinars, they're things where there's some opportunity for feedback. There's one-to-few. This is where you get much more focused group of like-minded advisors, again, in the independent space. There might be some segmentation here where you're selecting certain advisors based on certain criteria so you can go deep on their issue. And one of the things we would argue is the best way to segment is readiness. And I'm going to show you a little model in a minute on how to segment by readiness. In a broker-dealer world, an employee-based broker-dealer world, it might be by branch, and then obviously the one-to-one. We call that desktop level. So those are some of the change management kind of things. Boiling it down, one, have solid feedback mechanisms, make them transparent both to the advisors and the home office. Number two is prove to yourself, prove to the advisors that you're listening and you're making concrete changes. And it doesn't matter if you've got 200 suggestions and you only implemented 3. The fact you implemented 3 is a big, big deal because, again, in the advisor's mind, you don't listen to them. You don't listen to them effectively enough. And as firms, we've got to prove to them. And even if it's only 3 is a heck of a lot better than 0. And we can prove that these 3 changes we made were based on direct feedback that we got from our users. Publicize that. We have a client that, again, in their communication will make specific call-outs to specific advisors for changes. That works. And then lastly, the advocates, using the example I gave earlier about the conference speaker and that sort of thing. Let's talk about marketing and triggers here. And my time's a little bit short. So a lot of times we're good as firms marketing if we're going to go recruit new advisors. We've got this marketing department, we've got slick brochures, we've got all this material. Why don't we turn that inside and focus on how do we market our internal programs to our advisors using the whole consumer adoption model. Here's the readiness assessment. This has been one of our real secret weapons. Back to my point of that 3-legged stool, training does not correlate to usage. Readiness correlates to usage. And in fact, the kind of training and how I'm going to interact with an advisor will be completely different based on their readiness. If I have a low motivation advisor, they're like, listen, I don't really understand how this has any value. All the training I do is completely worthless. I've got to sit down and say, all right, Mr. Advisor, well, maybe you've got some valid points. Let's talk about why. Let's get to the business case. Let's get to the why. Let's not even spend 2 seconds talking about what the product does, talking about the solution does, training you on how to click this button and that button, because that is worthless. Versus another advisor, I get the why, just show me how. Versus a third that says, I get the why, I know how, I just don't have any time. Help me, that conversation is more of a delegation kind of conversation. So the ability, and we call it scalable mass customization. In our professional opinion, this is the one thing we've seen work time and time again, is if you create a customized training plan for every advisor, we'll call it adoption plan for every advisor, your usage will go up. And it's a lot easier than you think because, again, there's only really 3 variables. So if you do the math, it feels ultra custom to every advisor, but it's, we've got low readiness, medium skill, high time. You're talking about essentially 9 plans that you would have, and then customizing the experience. It also sends a message to the advisor in the practice that you're listening to them. You're hearing what they're saying. Triggers are another very powerful concept. These are so obvious and underutilized. And this is where both in terms of workflow and what I call just-in-time training. As we all know, you do the traditional training, most people recollect like 10% of what they learn in those training. In the case of triggers, what you're able to do is put it just in time pop-up. So I'm gonna click the new account opening button. I get the training or the steps embedded in a wizard-like capability right then and there. I'm going to be much more likely to use that versus trying to remember some training or some webinar I attended 6 weeks earlier. So triggers are really important. Here's some specific examples of triggers. So how do we create triggers in our environment? There are 4 things that correlate to the effectiveness of a trigger. One is frequency. Every time I launch it, that pop-up comes up. Every time I look at the phone, and triggers can be simple physical things like a sticky note on a phone. If I'm thinking of picking up that phone to call customer service, I could have a little sticky made that says, hey, every time I pick up the phone, it costs my practice $15 versus if I use that online account opening wizard, that's 50 cents. I have that little sticky on my phone. I'm seeing that all day, every day. That's very powerful. The strength of the link, how correlated is the trigger to the action, the uniqueness of it, and then obviously proximity to the desired behavior. So as you're designing triggers that are going to trigger the actions that you're looking for, these are 4 factors that you want to keep in mind. Again, let's not keep it a secret. We want to be clear with our users as to what choices we want them to make and making it obvious. Again, back to my example of the economics. Again, let's assume even if we did that business case exercise and we showed them both the cost to them in terms of time and energy using the traditional, I'm gonna fill a paper form and send it in, plus the cost to the broker-dealer, let's keep that really, let's make that really visible. Let's turn it, this is $250 or $50 versus $10. Keep that in front of them and those triggers in context. So you're sure you want to do that. And even we've had phone reps, talk to the advisor, will call in to, do a request they could much more efficiently and effectively do online. Rep will say, listen, I'd be happy to serve you, but are you aware of the cost differential here? Are you aware of this benefit? Has anyone walked you through that? And then, using some just-in-time business case, let me walk you through what it's costing you to do it this way. Those kinds of things. Again, we can do it, depending upon how much, it's the old, how much choice you want to give versus how much mandate. But what I'd like to do is flip that on its head and say, listen, your job is to serve the advisor ultimately. They're the ones that are generating the revenue. Let's educate them. We're not here to shove things down their throat. We're here to make them better. We do a poor job of being clear as to what does better mean. We assume they know more about this than they do, and we don't remind them nearly frequently enough. They've got to hear this, the message of the NIGO rates. They've got to hear this 7 different times, 7 different ways. How do we put triggers in the appropriate place? And it might not trigger till the 5th time, might not trigger till the 9th time, but once that thing triggers and they realize it, the usage becomes wired into their operating model and you never have to explain it again. So to invest a little bit more up front to make that clear is really important. Here's some key action steps as to how do you make these triggers real. I'm not going to go through all of them. I know I'm a little bit short on time. I do want to flip through reporting and leaderboards. This is another thing that we find you can use both internally and externally. What gets measured gets done, and one of the things that we find frequently is that firms underestimate the importance of awareness. Just putting that report, just making people aware will, by design, change behavior. And there's some interesting concepts in terms of how do you do that effectively. And I won't go through each of these. If you guys want a copy of the presentation, I'd be happy to send it to you. But there's a certain set of best practices, and this is sort of our checklist as to how you do this to get through it. Again, talking about how do you separate the measurement from the behavioral change. So again, I've kind of blown through a lot of this, but the point being is that this is a the way, and hopefully I've given you some really good examples of how you can take what Gabe was talking about yesterday and some of the other things that you've heard at this conference and make them very concrete and real. Every one of you in this room, for example, can put a little designation on an associate's business card without any new technology implementation, without permission from anybody else, doing something as simple as that. Start there. You don't need to do 52 things. So hopefully I've given you some good food for thought. With that, are there any questions before I pop off? Well, thank you so much for your time.